Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Doris Meister, Head of Wealth Management at M&T Bank and Wilmington Trust. I'd like to thank you for joining us for tonight's panel discussion, World Affairs and the Enduring American Revolution, Women's Rights. This is the second annual event in a three-part joint collaboration between two of Philadelphia's crowning civic institutions, the Museum of the American Revolution and the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. Wilmington Trust has been a proud supporter of the World Affairs Council for more than 2 decades, and we are delighted to support this event along with the Museum of the American Revolution. Tonight, we will examine women's rights around the world, from the 1770s to today, and the important role of women in the 2020 presidential election and beyond. This discussion is all the more poignant this year as we celebrate the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution 100 years ago, which granted American women the right to vote. Democracy demands discourse, not from a few, but from all. Our panel tonight will scrutinize our progress and focus as well on what remains to be done to protect and expand the rights of women globally. Wilmington Trust is a member of the M&T Bank family. We are a community bank and a bank for communities. This is both our mission and our model. Given our experience in helping to create healthy communities, we see the vital role that we can play as the glue that binds our communities, driving both economic progress and social change. Both Wilmington Trust and M&T are committed to the Philadelphia community, but know that the conversation here today extends far beyond geography and explores some of the most important conversations affecting all of our communities. I'm now going to turn this over to Dr. R. Scott Stephenson, President and CEO of the Museum of the American Revolution, and Lauren Swartz, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia, who will further introduce their organizations and our moderator for tonight's event.
Thank you, Doris, and thanks to Wilmington Trust for that warm introduction for myself and for this evening's event, and for your sponsorship of this program this evening. As Doris mentioned, I'm Scott Stephenson. I am the President and CEO of the Museum of the American Revolution here at 3rd and Chestnut Streets, just 2 blocks from Independence Hall in Philadelphia, for those of you who are not from the area. And I'm so delighted to have you here this evening as the virtual host of this evening's panel discussion. This is the second in a 3-part series that we've collaborated with our friends at the World Affairs Council to produce. So welcome to all of you, those from the World Affairs Council and the museum families, our members, our supporters, particularly to those of you who are newcomers to our organizations and to this program series. I know you're in for a real treat tonight, a real gathering of some extraordinary minds on such a topical subject during this presidential election year. Now, I'm so excited also that this evening's program is happening in conjunction with the launch of the museum's new special exhibition called When Women Lost the Vote, A Revolutionary Story. This is an exhibition, a physical exhibition here at the museum that's been sponsored by Bank of America and Comcast, NBC Universal. We just launched it at the beginning of the month, and it will be here at the museum through April of next spring. Now, you'll hear more a little bit later in the program about the extraordinary story we tell in the exhibition about the first generation of women voters, and they are not the women that you probably think they are. It's a really remarkable new story. And so I just wanted to give you a little glimpse, a little peek at some of the great objects here in the museum. Behind me is a series of letters back and forth between John and Abigail Adams, and actually just the letter far off to my left, I guess it would be the right of your screen, is not just a letter, but the letter that you'll all be, of course, familiar with. I long to hear that you have declared an independency, and by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Now, in these COVID times, we've all discovered the power of these virtual programs. We can gather from around the nation, literally from around the world, for great programs like this evening. Just later this fall, by the end of October, early November, you should be able to log on and experience a virtual version of our remarkable exhibit, When Women Lost the Vote. You'll be able to see images of many of those objects, but there is a power being in the presence of these objects. So I would desire that you would remember the museum. Do not put such unlimited power in Zoom, for instance. Remember, all screens would keep you captive forever if they could. Our museum is open now from Thursdays to Sundays each week from 10 to 5. We use our time ticket system, so we have extreme social distancing. It's very uncrowded. If you're able and comfortable traveling and venturing outside, there is a real humbling and moving experience of being in the presence of these objects. Abigail Adams' Remember the Ladies letter is on display in the museum at 3rd and Chestnut Streets. It's its first time it has been back to Philadelphia since it was mailed to John Adams in March of 1776. Or the power of seeing the dress that Deborah Sampson, a twice wounded Continental Army soldier who donned a uniform to conceal her gender, wore to her wedding just shortly after the nation won its independence, or to read the names of women and people of color in a handwritten ledger of New Jersey voters from 1801, or to learn the remarkable story of the enslaved woman known as Mum Bet, who heard the revolutionary promise of equality in the Massachusetts home of her enslaver. She found a lawyer. She successfully sued for her freedom. And she celebrated that victory by giving herself the name Elizabeth Freeman, which still is inscribed and visible on her tombstone in Massachusetts. Those are experiences you can have here in the museum, and we hope that you all will come and visit us. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Lauren Swartz, the new president and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia, who's going to introduce this evening's program. Lauren has just stepped into this role this year after a very wide-ranging and distinguished career in public and private service, a specialist in international business, international affairs, has already been recognized as a leading light in Philadelphia's rising generation of leaders under 40. And I'm really excited that she's taken the helm, that we're continuing to work together. And so I just, without further ado, love to pass the baton on to Lauren, who will introduce this evening's program. Thanks to you all for being here.
Thank you, Scott, for that kind introduction. I am Lauren Swartz, the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. And we are so pleased to once again partner with the museum on an important series like this, the World Affairs and the Enduring American Revolution. We'd also like to extend our gratitude to Wilmington Trust for sponsoring this evening's program. And thank you to Doris for your remarks at the top of the hour. At this moment in time, when we see people marching through our streets across the nation and people lined up to vote early in towns, small and large, and a world in flux, revisiting the revolution feels right on target. It feels a little scary, but ever more important. So thank you for joining us tonight. As many of you know, and as was mentioned by Doris, democracy demands discourse is the founding idea of the World Affairs Council, and it infuses every program we put together like this. These conversations are deeply important to provide a platform for civil and nonpartisan discourse that can be a catalyst for growth and for change. Civic institutions like the ones you're with tonight will help us reapproach our own democracy, flaws and all, to make it better. Throughout this series, World Affairs and the Enduring American Revolution, we are reminded that democracy is a work in progress. And in order for this American project to continue, for this project to be long-lasting and to work for all people, we must participate, including us ladies, as Abigail Adams said. The world looks a lot different today than it did 100 years ago when the 19th Amendment was ratified here in the US. That happens to be my grandmother's exact birthday, so I never forget the date. There's no doubt that women have made progress, but so many, especially Black and brown women, still face marginalization and discrimination, both here in the United States and around the world. So tonight, let us all remember that democracy does demand discourse. And that discourse involves not only speaking, but truly listening with open minds. It involves speaking to all, which is why the World Affairs Council is dedicated to providing civil and civic and foreign affairs to nearly 3,000 students across our region. These students are not just our leaders of tomorrow, but as recent events have reminded us, they are the leaders of today. And tonight we have a very special guest, Nadia Sulchai, a junior from Julia R. Masterman High School in Philadelphia, who is excited to ask our final question to the panelists. Nadia is a member of the World Affairs Club at Masterman School, and she's excited to be able to join us tonight. Then we can really see what the future looks like. Now, without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce another fearless female leader, our moderator and opening speaker for this evening, Errin Haines. Errin is a founding member and editor-at-large for The 19th. This is a nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom that reports on gender, politics, and policy. She's an award-winning journalist with nearly 2 decades of expertise, working previously as a national writer on race and ethnicity for the Associated Press, and before that, working for the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post. Tonight, Errin will provide us with some opening context for the discussion before introducing our panelists for a moderated discussion and closing out our evening with some audience question and answer. Errin, thank you so much for being with us here tonight, and I turn the virtual microphone over to you.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and welcome everybody to this conversation. I am honored to be joining you tonight because the Museum of the American Revolution believes, as I do and as we do at the 19th, that the revolution is ongoing and recognizes those who were excluded from the first revolution, but who were nonetheless absolutely present and who heard its message that echoes across our democracy today. I continue to be inspired by women from Abigail Adams to Elizabeth Freeman and Phyllis Wheatley, and I just really encourage all of you to visit the museum and have your ideas of the revolution challenged anew. So as was said, I'm Errin Haines and I'm editor-at-large at The 19th, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom that is focused on the intersection of women, politics, and policy. And at the beginning of the year, I was among 5 women who decided to launch this newsroom that was the vision of former Texas Tribune editor Emily Ramshaw, who was frankly frustrated after the 2016 election, as I'm sure many of you were, with the journalism around how women in politics, both as candidates and as voters, is covered and who is driving those narratives. We at the 19th believe that the news is already gendered. Most of the stories are written by and greenlit by folks who are either white, male, or both. And the 19th seeks to level that playing field with journalism that provides nuance, that accurately reflects the majority of the electorate, and that centers marginalized parts of our democracy who have previously felt unseen and unheard. Our newsroom is named for the 19th Amendment, the centennial of which we recognize this year, but with an asterisk, in recognition of the omission of the Black women in particular who were blocked from access to the franchise by the white women with whom they fought shoulder to shoulder for that right. The asterisk in our logo is a reminder of our commitment to the ongoing work of expanding our democracy and to include those who have for too long been excluded and erased. Our newsroom launches at a remarkable moment in our country and in our politics, where again, a record number of women are running for Congress, and for the first time, a Black woman is the vice presidential nominee for a major political party. Still, we know that despite being the majority of the US population, women remain underrepresented in our government. We also know that women will be the deciders of this election. They are not only headed to the polls in droves, either in person or by mail, but they are phone banking, texting, door knocking, and donating like never before. Women are energized and galvanized by a range of issues because, as we assert at the 19th, all issues are women's issues, and voting rights is women's rights. We deserve to be covered not as a special interest group, but for who we are, the majority of the electorate. We are not monolithic. We are rural, urban, Midwestern, Southern, college-educated, blue-collar, evangelical, LGBTQ, and so on. According to our reporting at the 19th, among the issues that we know are driving women to the polls are the dual pandemics of coronavirus and systemic racism, equity, the Supreme Court, the future of the Affordable Care Act, and voting rights, among others. The story of 2020 will be who women elect, and it is our priorities that will be the ones that matter, not only on Election Day, but as our government takes office next year and women continue to hold our elected officials accountable. With that, I'm really excited to dive into and unpack this topic with an esteemed panel of women that I'll introduce to you in just a moment. Each of them are also going to share some brief remarks to frame our conversation before we get into our moderated discussion and then take some questions from you. With that, I want to start with Dr. Rosemarie Zagarri, historian at George Mason University, who will be followed by Jovida Hill, Executive Director of the Mayor's Office for the Engagement of Women for the City of Philadelphia, and Rachel B. Vogelstein, Douglas Dillon Senior Fellow and Director of the Women in Foreign Policy Program at the Council of Foreign Relations. Dr. Zagarri, you may begin.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so it's a thrill to be with you, if not in person, online then. And I'm so grateful to the Museum of the American Revolution and the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia for sponsoring this event, because I do think it's so important that we get a long view of women's participation in the American Revolution. I think with this being the centennial year of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, there's been a lot of talk about women voting, but what this wonderful new exhibit at the Museum of the American Revolution does is give us a glimpse into a moment during the era of the American Revolution when possibilities were glimpsed, when it was seen that women and even free blacks and free black men and free black women should vote on the same terms as whites, and how that moment disappeared. And so I'd like to then just give you a very, very brief overview of this episode. So what I think it's important, and I'll take the first slide, important to understand is that even though women were not allowed to vote during the period before the American Revolution, during the period of the colonial British rule in North America, during the lead up to the revolution in the 1760s and 1770s, women started to become more involved in the politics of the streets. You would have the first inklings of women's political activism. And that activism expressed itself by women participating in a number of what you might call extra-legal political activities. So one of the most important efforts that was made by the colonists to protest their opposition to taxation without representation took the form of boycotts of not buying British goods. And since women were major consumers, it was understood by political leaders at the time, male political leaders, that they needed to enlist women to support this cause. And so in the slide, if you could go back to that slide just for a minute, what you see is women actually signing among themselves a boycott agreement. These are the patriotic ladies of Edenton, North Carolina. And the women look kind of funny because this engraving was printed in London, and it's a rather sarcastic and negative take on women's participation. But this involvement of women in the boycotts actually empowered women. It enabled women to start to think of themselves as political agents. It gave them a sense that they might be important to the nation's political life. And it led men to understand that even non-voting women had an important role to play in political activities of some sorts. We had other individual women. Abigail Adams was mentioned. She actually participated more through her home life and supporting John Adams while he was away for so many years. But we had other women like Phyllis Wheatley, who wrote poems supporting the patriotic cause, and in particular, George Washington. We had Mercy Otis Warren from Massachusetts, who wrote patriotic poems and plays to support the revolutionary cause. We had Esther DeBert Reed of Philadelphia, who actually organized women in Philadelphia to go door to door, raising money for the support of the Continental troops. And she and her allies actually raised more than $300,000 for the troops. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. As I say, more and more women were becoming involved in various ways in political activity. And this changed the way that both men and women thought about women as political beings. And even though it didn't change in most states, the political status of women, it did in one particular state, and that is New Jersey. And some people say, why New Jersey? And I can't answer that, but I will tell you what did happen in New Jersey. When the United States declared independence in 1776, all of the states, the state legislatures were asked to write new state constitutions, to create a new fundamental charter of government. And in writing those new constitutions, New Jersey did something interesting. When it was talking about who could vote in that state, it described the voters as inhabitants, what we would call a gender neutral term, inhabitants who possessed a certain amount of property, 50 pounds proclamation money. And what this did was actually sort of open up the possibility that women might vote. Now, there were several other states that actually had gender neutral language, but women didn't vote in those states. And we know, though, that in New Jersey in 1790 and in 1797, the Virginia legislature actually passed laws that referred to voters specifically as he and she, So we know that the New Jersey legislators wanted to enfranchise women, and we know, especially now from the wonderful research of the staff at the Museum of the American Revolution, that women actually did vote, and they did so in some interesting numbers. We don't know for sure how many women voted, but we now have lists of the voters from many localities in New Jersey. So we know that women named Susanna Bradway and Mary Chester and Madalena Simpkins all voted. Now, these women were not ordinary women in a certain sense. They had to have a certain amount of wealth, and that was true of male voters as well. But there was another requirement. At this time, women who were married were not allowed to own property. So the women who voted in New Jersey were actually unmarried women. That could be single women or women who were widowed, who met the property qualification for voting. But the most important point here is that women were voting on the same terms as men. Women were voting on the same terms as men, and the world didn't collapse, amazingly enough. Yet, from reading newspapers at the time, some people thought the world had collapsed. There was always a lot of controversy about these female voters of New Jersey. Some people attacked them as manly women. Other people attacked them as not having sufficient knowledge to be able to vote. Still other people resented that these women had too much power. Yet at the flip side of the coin, others said that they were simply pawns of the political parties. Again, we don't know for sure how many women voted, but based on this wonderful research from the Museum of the American Revolution, in some local elections, up to 10% of the voters may have been women. So, as I say, this was very controversial. And so there were numerous attempts to try and repeal the statute allowing women to vote. There were very extensive debates in the New Jersey legislature in 1799 and 1802, but there was a coalition that wanted to support the women voters, the petticoat electors, as they were called. But after a particularly contentious election over a courthouse, the location of a courthouse for some reason, there were these huge accusations of fraud and of people casting votes who were not eligible to vote. And what's interesting about these accusations of fraud is that it was said that women whose dress favored disguise were more likely to vote than more than once than men, or that some men dressed up as women so that they could vote, and that certain Black people voted who were not eligible to vote. So if you notice any echoes or resonances here about these accusations of fraud with the current times, I think you'd be right to hear that. The accusations of fraud were focused on those who were least able to defend themselves. And what that led to was, in 1807, a coalition in the New Jersey legislature gathering together and passing a law that expanded white male suffrage to include all men, whether or not they owned property, but then simultaneously eliminated the right of free Black men and women and white women to vote. So this 1807 law in the New Jersey legislature eliminated the franchise for anyone except white males. And that's the last time women voted until after the Civil War, when some of the Western states began state by state to enfranchising women. And I guess if there's one takeaway here, what I'd like to remind people of is that, we can be allowed to vote, but we have to exercise that right to vote. And that the right to vote it should be a cherished right and privilege, but that it can be threatened, and that people who are corrupt and who want to undermine the democratic process often level these charges of fraud and corruption on those who are least able to defend themselves through the electoral process, which leaves it to all the rest of us to make sure that they're defended. Thank you.
Good evening. Rosemarie, thank you very much, because I'd like to underscore this whole idea about how precious this right to vote. In many ways, many times I've done voter registration for, I'm not going to say how many years, but oftentimes I've heard from people, why should I vote? Things don't change. And my answer has always been, if your right to vote didn't mean anything, why are people trying to take it away from you? So with that, I want to say good evening. I am Jovida Hill. I am the Executive Director of both the Mayor's Office of Engagement for Women and the Philadelphia Commission for Women. And I appreciate this opportunity to participate in this thoughtful discussion. I appreciate the World Affairs Council and the Museum of the American Revolution for organizing this panel with such amazing women. And of course, our illustrious moderator. I am so honored to be here today. The Philadelphia Commission for Women was created in 2015 by a ballot referendum to advance gender equality for women of Philadelphia. And from the outset, we embraced Kimberly Crenshaw's framework of intersectional feminism that takes into account the many ways we experience oppression and gender inequality. And from this perspective, we always consider in our office and in this commission how race, gender identity, economic status, age, culture, disability, zip code, geography, and the multiple ways our environment, and most especially how race and class marginalize our gender experience. This guidepost demands a racial equity lens that informs our priorities. It's also a gender justice framework that takes into consideration that without racial and economic justice, gender justice will always remain elusive. And so, when we take into account the demographics of the city of Philadelphia and its unfortunate status as one of the poorest big cities in the nation, economic issues remain front and center of our advocacy agenda. That has included pay equity, raising the minimum wage, access to menstrual hygiene products for school, access to menstrual hygiene products for incarcerated women, fair work week scheduling, a domestic workers' bill of rights that, for the first time, will provide enforcement of workers' contracts to protect workers from sexual harassment, wage theft, and will guarantee paid time off. And this is some of the most progressive legislation in the entire country. We also look at dignity for incarcerated women and advocacy to address maternal mortality disparities, among other issues that impact Philadelphia's Black and brown women and girls. So it is with a racial equity lens that we embark on commemorating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment with a civic engagement initiative that we call Suffrage, Race, Power, Unerased. This initiative is a national civic engagement digital destination that is the brainchild of public policy strategist Gwen McKinney. The website includes a series of podcasts featuring prominent thought leaders on issues like the likability factor, and stories about Black women from all walks of life, past, presents, that we call patriots and pathfinders. Our thinking around suffrage, race, and power is to change the narrative around the history of women voting, around the role of Black women in earning the right to vote, Black women as leaders, and the role of Black women in voter participation, especially in the context of the upcoming November election. And we know that it is women who will make a difference at this critical time. We wanted to use the anniversary of the 19th Amendment as a jumping off point to celebrate and elevate the role of Black women. Not only our participation in the right to vote, but our role in universal suffrage. Born of the abolition movement, we wanted to show a suffrage continuum from the passage of the 15th Amendment that granted the right to vote to Black men, the civil rights movement that led to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and up to today, when we see all across the nation and all across the city, voting lines. And some of this is fueled by LaTosha Brown's Black Voters Matter voter participation campaign. So with this in mind, I think it's quite appropriate to mention one of the founders of the World Affairs Council, Crystal Bird Fawcett, who was one of Philadelphia's patriots and pathfinders. Fawcett was a civil rights activist, and in 1938, she was the first African-American woman to be elected to a state legislature in the United States. During her time in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, she was an advocate for affordable housing and legislation to end racial discrimination in employment. She also sponsored an amendment to Pennsylvania's female labor law that would improve workers' rights for women. She was also innovative. Crystal Bird Fawcett was one of the first candidates for public office to use the telephone in her campaign efforts. And many of us are still doing that during this pandemic. I think that there are a lot of people here today who are phone banking on behalf of their preferred candidate. Fawcett served in the Roosevelt administration, and when she thought that the Democratic Party was not moving quickly or fast enough on civil rights issues, she left the party and joined the Republican Party. She later turned to global issues. Fawcett was one of the founders of the United Nations Council in Philadelphia, which was the forerunner of what is now the World Affairs Council. Fawcett's Pennsylvania district was in the same West Philadelphia community where I grew up. Yet, up until a few years ago, I'd never even heard of her. There are thousands of Crystal Bird Fawcetts whose stories have been erased. It is to them and for them we have dedicated this 3.5-minute video that we are calling Unerased, a Black Woman's Love Song. Thank you.
Unerased, unerased, lift up Black women today. 100 years of pain, suffrage, and sorrow. Yesterday, today, and tomorrow. It's time to honor those erased from her story. It's time to rise and take our place. In this moment we won't be erased. Time to rise, time to rise. Stand in our power today.
Black women are miracle workers.
Tell our story, how we offered our gifts without glory. Through the pain and the fears, the trial and the tears, despite the veil, we did not fail. Unerased Black women, unerased Black women. Our story must be told, the wisdom we hold. Stand in our power. Unerased Black women, unerased Black women. All that we've done and all that was won, the wisdom we hold, the stories untold. Stand in our power today. Unerased, 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 unerased,
I want to begin by thanking the Museum of the American Revolution and the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia for hosting this important discussion. And my fellow panelists, it's an honor to be with all of you. My name is Rachel Vogelstein. I lead the Women and Foreign Policy program at the Council on Foreign Relations, which analyzes how elevating the status of women and girls advances U.S. foreign policy objectives. So you've heard a bit tonight about one manifestation of women's power, the right to vote, as well as about women's civic activism and engagement. And I'd like to pull the lens back a bit to review women's political participation more broadly. So tonight I propose to answer 3 questions. First, where do women wield the most political power globally? In what capacities? And to look not only around the world, but also here in the United States in comparison. Second, why does women's political power matter? What does the evidence tell us? And third, what will it take to finally shatter the highest and hardest glass ceiling right here in the United States? So to answer these questions, I'm very pleased to share data from the Council's Women Power Index, which you can find on CFR's website, cfr.org. So let's start with our first question. How and where do women wield the most political power globally? The short answer is in far too few places. So today, 4 decades after the adoption of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and 25 years after the recognition that women's rights are human rights became a rallying cry at the 1995 United Nations 4th World Conference on Women in Beijing, we see today that women remain underrepresented in governments around the world. So out of 193 countries, only 22 countries currently have a female head of state or government. Only 14 countries have at least 50% women in the national cabinet, and only 4 countries have at least 50% women in the national legislature. So where are these women serving as heads of state? We've actually updated just recently based on the election of a woman head of state in the country of Togo, bringing the current total as of today to 22. The countries are Bolivia, Bangladesh, Barbados, Belgium, Denmark, Estonia, Ethiopia, Finland, Gabon, Georgia, Germany, Greece, Iceland, Nepal, New Zealand, Norway, Serbia, Singapore, Slovakia, Switzerland, Togo as of quite recently, and Trinidad and Tobago. In Finland, 34-year-old Sanna Marin became head of government this past December, making her the youngest head of government currently in office. Now, although only 22 out of 193 countries currently have a female head of state, it's important to note that the number of women serving as heads of state has grown significantly in the modern era, and particularly over the last 20 years. Since 1946, 64 countries have had a female head of state or government, and these countries from Bangladesh and Liberia to Germany and New Zealand vary significantly in terms of the overall status of women in society. But even in countries where women face steep political, economic, and social barriers, they've managed to climb the ladder all the way to the top. Several nations, such as Norway, Senegal, and the Philippines, have actually had more than one female head of state. And today, almost 100 women have led their countries since World War II, some during times of war, such as Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom, others through financial crises, such as Johanna Sigurðardóttir of Iceland. United States, of course, in comparison, is not on this list, and we'll talk about that more in just a bit. Let's move on to cabinet positions. As of January 2020, only 14 out of 193 countries had at least 50% female representation in the national cabinet. Those countries, Albania, Andorra, Austria, Canada, where the head of state specifically made a proclamation that the reason his cabinet would reflect equal numbers of men and women was because we were in the modern era. Colombia, Costa Rica, Finland, France, Guinea-Bissau, Nicaragua, Peru, Rwanda, Spain, and Sweden. In 2019, the proportion of women ministers worldwide reached an all-time high of 20.7%. And how does the US stand in comparison? The gender parity threshold has never been reached in the United States in terms of our national cabinet. And right now we are at a low as compared to the last several presidential administrations, with only 17% women in our current cabinet. On to the representation of women in parliaments and legislatures around the world. Still today, only 4 countries out of 193 have at least 50% female representation in the national legislature. Those countries: Bolivia, Cuba, Rwanda, and the United Arab Emirates. In all of those countries, quotas certainly help explain those results. And unsurprisingly, the paltry representation of women in parliaments globally is related to the proportion of women who run for legislative office. There's only 1 country out of 193 that had at least 50% registered female candidates in their most recent election for national legislature, and that country was Cuba. We see the same underrepresentation of women at the local legislative level. So for countries in which we have data, there are only 2 that have at least 50% female representation in local legislatures. Those countries are Antigua and Barbuda and Bolivia. So now that we've answered the question of where women are wielding power around the world and how the US compares, let's move on to our next question. Why does women's political participation and power matter? Well, in the aggregate, the evidence shows that women's leadership promotes bipartisanship, equality, and stability. And I'll give just a few examples. Common ground. Women are more likely to cross party lines to find common ground. There's a study of the US Senate that found that women senators more frequently work across the aisle and ultimately passed more legislation than their male counterparts. And in recent years, female US senators from both parties joined together to negotiate an accord to end a government shutdown. Women's political leadership matters in terms of equality and social welfare. Female lawmakers are more likely to advocate for policies that support education and health. And parliaments with a higher share of female lawmakers are also more likely to pass and implement legislation that advances equality, including laws related to domestic violence, sexual harassment, and sexual assault. And an increase in the share of women legislators is also positively correlated with investment in education and health. Women's leadership and political power also matters for stability. There's evidence that women's inclusion at leadership tables actually promotes stability. There's one study that found when women's parliamentary representation increases by just 5%, a country is almost 5 times less likely to respond to an international crisis with violence. And within countries, women's parliamentary representation is associated with a decreased risk of civil war and lower levels of state-perpetrated human rights abuses, such as disappearances, killings, political imprisonment, or torture. Finally, women's political participation matters for democratic governance. For democratic nations, if you truly believe in democratic government, then you must be committed to the full political participation of women, because democracy without the participation of women is nothing less than a contradiction in terms. And that brings us to our final question. What will it take for the United States to finally join so many other nations in electing a female head of state? Well, according to CFR's Women's Power Index, the United States overall ranks 125th out of 193 countries based on our political parity score. By way of comparison, the US ranks lower than Iraq, Jordan, Lithuania, Venezuela, and the United Arab Emirates. And out of 35 countries in the Americas, the United States ranks 28th. So with dismal numbers like these, am I optimistic for progress? Once again, I'd like to pull back the lens in answering that question to look at what's happening around the world. In recent years, we've seen a rising tide of women's activism that has swept the globe. Online and on the streets, millions upon millions of women have raised their voices and called for action against the systemic abuse, harassment, and discrimination that they face. This activism, importantly, has translated to the ballot box, with higher numbers of women running for office than ever before. And the result has been more women in power. So overall, women's global parliamentary representation has vastly improved, from a global average of 11% in 1995 to almost 25% in 2019. And the number of women being elected heads of state or government has also surged over the last 3 decades. More than 85% of all female leaders taking office did so after 1990. And more than 3/4 of these women rose to power in the 2000s. Our last several election cycles in the United States are in line with this positive trend. In 2019, we saw a record number of women run for Congress and win, electing the most diverse class of representatives in our nation's history. And despite Hillary Clinton's loss in the 2016 election, the fact remains that for the first time in our nation's history, the majority of US voters cast their ballot for a woman. So I remain hopeful that the surge that we've seen in women's political participation, both in the US and around the world, will continue. And with that, I'll close and look forward to answering your questions.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists. I mean, everybody made some really excellent points around electability, framing kind of some of the foundations of women's participation in our democracy, even before we had access to the franchise, dispelling some myths and getting into some of the ways in which our history resonates even today, and centering and remembering some of those suffragettes and patriots that we don't always talk about, who have nonetheless helped to shape and perfect this union. And so I'm really excited to delve into this more with all of you. And don't forget, for those of you who are tuning in, we're going to save time for a few questions from the audience. So please do submit your questions to our chat, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can towards the end of this conversation. I want to start with since we are here in Philadelphia, I will say, being here, I think a lot about what it means to be a citizen, what it means to participate in our democracy at this moment. And I want to start with you, Jovida, about some of the biggest issues you see facing women with regard to this election and equal access to the ballot box, particularly in Philadelphia.
Wow. Well, before I answer that, I think I'd like to answer Rachel's question. And that's because Rachel said, what will it take for us to have a woman president? And for that, we have to go back to 2016. We have to underscore something that I said in my presentation, that there is no gender justice without racial justice and economic justice. And so we had 2016 when we had an opportunity to vote for a woman president, when 96% of Black women voted for the woman candidate and 53% of white women did not. So I needed to say that before I got to the second part of your question in terms of Philadelphia. Right now in Philadelphia, we are experiencing where there is such tremendous voter suppression, because Pennsylvania is one of the states where it's going to make a difference. But here's where I am encouraged. I am encouraged that every single day since there's been early voting, there have been lines at our satellite voting places. So Philadelphians, including Philadelphia women, are voting early, and I'm encouraged by that.
Rachel, I want to come to you because, you talked a lot in your presentation about women's representation in governments around the world. I'm wondering about women's access to the ballot box around the world. We are very focused at the 19th, obviously being named as a newsroom for an amendment dedicated to voting and women, but also, thinking about voter suppression and voter access in this election. I wonder, what in your work and research you've seen around women's access to the ballot, both in the U.S. But also in other countries. Are women, what is their access in this moment, and is that in jeopardy in other places in the world right now?
It's a great question, and the same fault lines that you've heard my esteemed co-panelists talk about with respect to the barriers that exist, not only for women, but particular groups of women, the intersection of discrimination on the basis of gender and race, or gender and ethnicity, gender and class, gender and religion. We still see those same barriers for women in different countries around the world. So it is not an accident that the first global wave of the women's movement, which was largely focused on this fundamental right of citizenship, the right to vote, that was a fight that was incredibly hard fought and hard won. It took 100 years from the first country granting the right to vote in the 1890s to see virtually every country in the world now grant that right to women, at least on paper today. And just as we saw in our own country that the 19th Amendment guaranteed the right to vote for white women, but not for women of color, we saw those same issues in other countries as well, that, for example, excluded Native women and many other groups of women. And of course, the right to exercise the franchise depends on the power and the status of women across society. Do you have the economic means if there are barriers put in place? Do you have the power to negotiate transportation and access? Do you have the threat of violence, which is a rising concern for women running for office around the world? Of course, we saw a recent example of that right here in Michigan with the planned attack on the governor there, a woman in power there. And we see many examples of that around the world, whether it's women exercising their right to vote, or women exercising their right to run, or women exercising their right to lead once they've been elected. So this is a pressing issue, and one in which the United States is in common cause with many other countries around the world in terms of its need to better address it.
Rosemarie, I want to come to you because I love having a historian in the room, because you are so good at framing kind of what the past can teach us about the moment that we are now in. And I'm thinking about, in your presentation, what I was struck by was just the idea that 100 years later, our democracy is again reckoning with women as a political force, right? And that definition is one that's expanding. Rachel kind of alluded to this, and we have actually a question in the chat that may relate to this as well. You talked about kind of, people seeing women's vote as a threat, early on when we got that vote, and how that led to voter suppression of women and other marginalized groups. And that really feeding into the idea that the right to vote is not only something that has to be exercised, but something that has to be protected. What do you feel like the lessons that we can learn, from the past? What are those lessons that kind of, are some of the things that you're thinking about in this moment with the threat to voter access, particularly for women right now?
Well, I think one of the curious aspects of this episode, and one reason I think it didn't get the attention it deserves for a long time, is that we don't know of any efforts by the women who lost the vote to protest against their loss of the vote. And it's somewhat historically complicated, but at this time, really voting was a privilege of property. Only property owners were able to vote. And so women actually were given the vote. And it's a curious thing, but they were given it by men who extended that idea of, single women, unmarried women who are widows pay taxes. So if we believe in no taxation without representation, then unmarried women who own property should be allowed to vote. Now, a later generation of women, beginning with the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, and then the post-Civil War suffragettes began to change that basis of voting. You know, they were demanding that voting was a right that belonged to every adult person in the United States. And, you know, we talk about it routinely. Voting is a right, not a privilege. But I guess one of the lessons, well, I think there's two lessons from this episode pertinent to your question. One is that I think there was a backlash against women voting. It was very threatening to men. I think particularly the idea that it wasn't just white women voting, it was also free Black men and women. So I think that that sense of backlash, and I see a question in the chat about as women gain more political power, how will it affect the relationship with men? I think that there is always a danger of backlash, not that that should deter us, but I think that that is something that actually we're living through. And I also think that one of the reasons that women didn't rise up and protest in 1807 when they lost the vote is that they didn't consider it a right, they didn't cherish it, they didn't see its potential for affecting change. And I think, as Jovida said, you know, when she tells people to vote and they say, well, it won't change anything, I think that, you know, you have to emphasize to people that every vote does count. And we've had so many close votes, and especially in an era of voter suppression, every vote counts even more, and you have to make sure that your vote is counted. So I would just take away from that episode that we have to be more vigilant than ever in the present moment for voting, exercising the right to vote, and protecting those who are voting.
You know, you make such a good point, because again, to the Black women who, you know, were fighting shoulder to shoulder, Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell, Mary McLeod Bethune, and so many others who fought for that right and didn't get it. The Black women who are absolutely suffragettes, even though they did not get suffrage in 1920, the almost half century that they had to continue to push until they got their access to the ballot box with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. You know, I think because that was so much, I mean, so very hard fought, they had to fight twice as hard, you know, and have only had access to the ballot for about half as long. And yet their right to vote remains fragile. We know that with the ongoing threat of voter suppression, and seeing that they are still having to fight for that, frankly, in the absence, a lot of them tell me, of white women who really kind of didn't continue that fight after they got their access to the franchise. And so I think, you know, 100 years later, as we think about the centennial suffrage, I know that I'm hearing from a lot of, you know, Black women activists who are wishing and hoping that in this moment they have white women allies who are, you know, going to also work as hard as some of their foremothers did to make sure that all women and all marginalized groups have access to this democracy. Particularly in a pandemic. And I also want to ask you about this, Rosemarie, and maybe you can talk about, I mean, frankly, the suffrage movement was happening as there was a pandemic in this country. You know, some people, most of us were not around for the Spanish flu, but certainly there was a pandemic that was happening in our democracy before. What can you say about the pandemic of 1918? And how that affected suffrage and also women's commitment to voting?
I don't know a whole lot about that specifically. I think it's actually a fantastic question, because maybe it'll provide some clues for us today. But, you know, I do know that the response in 1918 was once again very localized. I mean, it varied a lot from place to place. So I would expect there to be a great deal of variation in the efforts to campaign for the vote, and also voter turnout. But I think that's a wonderful question. And actually, I'm going to see if are there any articles on it that I could take a look at?
I've read some. I think National Geographic maybe wrote about it. Jovida, I want to ask you, I mean, we know Black people are being disproportionately killed and getting sick from, COVID-19, and yet they are absolutely committed to participating in this election. Black women are the frontline workers. They're the essential workers, the domestic workers, who are really at the center of the economic crisis, the childcare crisis that this pandemic has laid bare. I want to talk to you specifically about the inequalities this pandemic has laid bare for women in Philadelphia, how that is translating maybe politically for those women, and how you maybe are hopeful that can translate into policy even beyond Election Day.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. As a result of the pandemic and as a result of the demographics of the city of Philadelphia, we sponsored a policy forum around the whole idea of the impact of COVID-19 on Black and brown women. And we're also doing these forums with other women work groups so that by the end of the year, we want to present to our policy office. These are the things that women need to be held in the workplace. But there's also a question that was in the chat that was asking me, how is voter suppression being held in Philadelphia? And it's been statewide, actually. It has been through voter ID laws that goes back a decade or two. These voter ID laws were suppressing the vote in Philadelphia. And right now, during this election cycle, Pennsylvania has been the site of several legislation attacks by lawsuits to eliminate our satellite voting places. There have been legal attacks on whether or not we could do early voting. And all of these lawsuits in Pennsylvania has been around suppressing the vote. But once again, the more you try to take away our vote, the more we want to vote. We have seen lines in Philadelphia and across the state that we have not seen ever, not even in 2008, when that was a life-changing vote. We're seeing the more you try to take away our vote, the more we want to claim it. And so these voter suppression tactics, I'm hoping will not work in terms of suppressing the vote in Philadelphia. So I think I kind of halfway answered your
Encourage everybody. Early in-person voting is underway as we speak. It is ongoing until October the 27th. You can go to the Pennsylvania elections website to find out where your precinct is, where you can cast your ballot. If you have a mail-in ballot, where you can drop that off at a safe location. Very important to do so. I'd be remiss working at the 19th if I did not encourage everybody to participate in our democracy. Rachel, I want to come back to you because you mentioned one of kind of my favorite words, electability, which we try to disabuse people of at the 19th. I believe that, electability is about who gets elected, right? You vote for somebody, they win, they're electable. I'm wondering though, just to expand that, I know a lot of that conversation, I covered a cycle that saw a historic 6 women stand for office, and yet, there were still questions of likability, right? In the Veep stakes process, there were questions of ambition, as if every man who's ever been considered for vice president didn't actually eventually want to be president of the United States, right? So what are some of, how does that look around the world? Like what are the electability questions? What are some of the narratives around women who, are seeking to run for office, some of the ways in which they, are dismissed either in the media or just among voters? What are some of those conversations?
That's a terrific question, and I've had occasion to give this a lot of thought, not only as a scholar now looking at women's leadership around the world, but also as someone who worked on the 2008 and 2016 campaigns of Secretary Hillary Clinton when she tried 2 times to become the first woman president. And what's really striking when you pull back the lens and look at this issue globally is how common the stereotypes and the language that is used to discuss women seeking power is around the world. So for example, here we often hear voters say, I'd be perfectly happy to vote for a woman, just not that woman. And it turns out that when a woman is seeking to become the first or to claim political power, that is often the reaction. And because you see that commonality in so many different cultures, in different economies, in different countries, it becomes clear from a cross-cultural perspective that there's something more happening than aversion to one particular woman, because women of all sorts of different backgrounds, races, ethnicities, faiths, seem to meet this same challenge. So I would encourage you all to take a look at a terrific speech that former Prime Minister Julia Gillard, who was the first woman elected Prime Minister of the country of Australia, gave to the Parliament in response to many of the vicious sexist attacks that she was subject to in Australian society writ large, but also in particular by members of the Australian Parliament. It's a terrific speech that went viral, and you can hear how many of the adjectives that we hear bandied about in the mainstream press here, including this question of likability, also were issues that she faced. And there are so many women who have now served as heads of state in their countries who have shared very similar stories. You know, I also see a question in the chat about why the United States is behind so many other nations when it comes to the number of women in politics and the extent to which they have risen to the top of the field. And I think there's a few factors at play. Certainly a deeply ingrained gender bias that's fueled by a pervasive belief that women cannot win due to the sexism of other voters. So voters tend to say that they would support a woman, but they believe that their neighbors wouldn't, and then they make their decisions accordingly. We also know that heads of state in particular, if we're talking about presidential politics, are portrayed as sole executives and expected to act, quickly and decisively. And those are characteristics that in our culture are traditionally associated with masculinity. And so that becomes another challenge. And overcoming those popular stereotypes remain a challenge. We've actually seen that more women are able to rise to power through parliamentary systems in which the head of government is elected by party members who have had a chance to get to know that woman and perhaps to challenge some of the predispositions that they might have, as opposed to direct election through popular vote, where it becomes much more challenging. And I'll also just note that privilege and family ties certainly do play a role. So many women elected to higher office around the world are either highly educated or they also have direct kinship ties to former leaders. That's particularly often in the case of the first woman to break that barrier, including former President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner of Argentina, who was the First Lady herself prior to winning the presidency, or the former Prime Minister of Pakistan, Benazir Bhutto, who not only studied at Harvard and Oxford, elite institutions, but whose father served as Prime Minister and President. And then finally, I would note that female presidential candidates in the United States face a threshold that their counterparts in other countries don't, arguably campaigning for an office that is the most powerful position in the world.
That is all fascinating and very illuminating. And I will tell you that on the campaign trail, talking to primary voters, that question or that response of, well, I would vote for a woman, but I'm not sure about my neighbor. Or I'm not sure about somebody, in a swing state, and I'm just focused on, the person who can win, was often an excuse. And also to your point, I think the difference between 2016 and 2020 was there wasn't just one woman out there. There were 6, and none of them apparently were the one that the American electorate thought was the one that they should make the nominee. So, when you have 6 different women, it's hard to say, it's not that I wouldn't vote for a woman. I mean, it's not that I wouldn't vote for a woman. I just can't vote for this woman. Like, there were many women that they could have voted for many different ways. Women were showing that they could lead, and it didn't happen this year. But I want to take a couple of questions from our audience, and I appreciate everybody who submitted questions. We pulled a few of these, but just a couple of more before we wrap things up here. Catherine Tucker is asking, do more women get elected in multi-party systems than the 2-party system, particularly in the US. Rachel, you want to tackle this one if you know?
Sure. I mean, what we've found is parliamentary systems where you're being elected by your peers as opposed to direct election, that's where we see that the social science shows that women have an easier time rising to the head of state level.
Yeah. And you also made a really good point, Rachel, about, seeing women actually leading, gives people more confidence for women as they attempt to kind of move up in our politics as well. I'm thinking about, and especially in this pandemic, I feel like that has given so many women in this country an opportunity to show their leadership. I'm thinking about the women governors. I'm thinking about Black women mayors in a lot of cities who have been kind of front and center during this crisis, and people have really seen them getting national headlines for their leadership. And I wonder how that will bode. A lot of women were front and center in both the Republican and Democratic national conventions, having those kinds of roles and that kind of visibility, and what that might do for them going forward, I think is going to be really interesting for us to pay attention to. There was a question from Patricia Garza, who's asking, when women's suffrage really became a large movement, there were women who were against the vote for women. Is this still the case today? Are there still women who are against their right to vote? Anybody want to tackle this one? Rosemarie, Jovida?
I don't know that. I do know, I can relate it back to the ERA. There were a lot of women who were against the ERA. We didn't get the ERA.
Don't have it yet.
And we still don't have the ERA. But I think what we need to do is look at where we have come. Because when the original founding of this nation, it was for white men who were property owners. And so that idea of patriarchy and class still resonates today. Yeah. So patriarchy and class still keeps women down.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could I jump in with just a thought? I don't know of, reputable people who would openly oppose women voting in the United States today. There probably are some, but I think it's more subtle. I think it's, and I think it actually goes to your point, Jovida. It's, a woman who says, well, my vote will cancel out my husband's, or conversely, I'll just vote the way my husband votes. Or, women who just say, oh, well, I'm not interested in politics. Or men who say, well, women aren't that interested in politics. So I think the pressures that would in any way, cut against women voting or support the idea that some people don't think women should vote are more subtle than they used to be. But I do think they still exist in some places, among some groups in the United States today. And again, it's something that if people understood voting as both a right and a privilege, and something that they are obliged to do, that it's their civic duty, and that there were more, as we're talking about now, if election day was a holiday or held on the weekend, if it was made easier. I mean, I think early voting is one way, mail-in voting is another way, but I really think, making it easier for women with young children to vote, or women who are taking care of their parents. So it's more subtle, but I think the idea or the prejudice still exists in some places.
That's exactly right, Rosemarie. And I would just add to that, while it's not necessarily explicit, I think there are implicit ways that folks are still blocking women as the majority of the electorate from the ballot, right? Restricting early voting, which gives women more flexibility to get to the polls is one way. Not having a paid day off to go vote, or paid time off for somebody to go stand in line, especially in places where we know that the wait is longer for some people than just, going on your lunch break or going right before you go to the office. Some people have to stand in line for hours. They can't afford to take a day off to do that. A lot of those people are service workers. A lot of those service workers are women, right? And so I think that thinking about it in those terms, while it may not be somebody necessarily blocking, their entry to a precinct, it certainly is a barrier nonetheless. I'm going to take one more question from the audience before we take our student question, and that is from John Campbell, who asks, what role does religion play around the world in women achieving or not leadership positions of power?
I'm happy to jump in. I have not seen research that suggests that religion is a primary factor in the election or lack thereof of women. But I have seen plenty of evidence, particularly for those who break that highest and hardest glass ceiling for the very first time, that highly educated is a very common characteristic. This phenomenon of familial ties to power can often assuage voters who have questions about who this woman is, to know who her family members are and how they've served in the past. And certainly there are a range of factors that also make it possible for women and really any candidate to compete. In our US system, access to resources is a precondition of being able to compete. And in other countries, certainly there are other factors that relate to whoever has the dominant power that make it more or less likely for a woman to be able to win.
Well, those are great questions from our audience. We're going to have our last audience question from high school student Naja Sulchai and of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia to close us out here. So Naja, go ahead.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
So, as we just learned, America is right behind in gender equality, at least in a political setting. However, it's important to recognize, I think, that we have come a long way since the 1700s. What's an important lesson we can learn from looking back and reflecting on American feminist history to help us in our fight today for modern gender equality?
I'm happy to start. And as a student of American history and looking at these issues globally as well, I think one lesson is these rights are won. We are often told that women were given the right to vote in 1920, and we know that that story is incomplete for so many of the reasons that have already been discussed tonight. The notion that the 19th Amendment did not actually secure the right to vote for all American women, that it took the incredible dedication and work of so many to win the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and to address the ongoing issues with respect to disenfranchisement. But I think it's really important to characterize not only in the US and our history, but in the history of other countries around the world, this issue properly. The right to vote was not given. The right to vote was won and fought for. And that has been true not only for suffrage, but for every single right that women have won in this country and in other countries. So I think one lesson is you've got to participate, whether that means voting or protesting or running for office yourself, because this is something that is a fight that takes all of us to win.
I'd like to also add to that, Rachel, is that it's a continuing fight. The fight is not over. We are still fighting for that right. If you recall, the Supreme Court took away the pre-clearance aspects, the teeth in the Voting Rights Act that was won by blood, sweat, and tears in the Civil Rights Movement. That act, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, has been grossly weakened. And so that fight is still on. And there is right now in Congress, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act to put the pre-clearance aspects back in there. The right to vote is, it's still going on. And that's not just for women, but it's mostly for marginalized people. the right to vote is sacred if you are a white man and a white woman, but it's not sacred for the rest of us. And so we have to continue to be aware, and we have to continue to participate and participate in a way that secures our right to vote.
And I'll just add, this is a government of, by, and for the people. And no matter what anyone says, that really is the basis of our government. And if you feel disenfranchised, the only way to overcome that is by informing yourself, by participating, and by actually casting your vote. And that's the most immediate way you can do it. Again, these other ways are very important: protesting, writing to your legislatures, and expressing your voice in however you can. But, at the ballot box, the rubber hits the road, and it's really where you can make a difference, even if it doesn't feel like it. So it's sort of an act of faith and hope and trust. And I think that's one reason why people get so discouraged. But you can make a difference by encouraging your friends and family to vote.
All great responses. What I would add to that, Naja, is just that the collective power of women, especially politically, it is a remarkable thing. It was remarkable 100 years ago to see the women who fought for the right to vote finally break that barrier with the 19th Amendment, and the women who didn't get the right to vote at that time to continue that fight and to use their collective power until they won their access to the vote as well, and their continued fight and continued collective action to preserve that right is an inspiration to me at the 19th, and I know is an inspiration to so many across the country. So with that, I want to thank you for your question. I want to thank all of our panelists for their brilliant insights that have given me so much to think about in the 21 days, only 3 more Tuesdays, you guys, until election day. A lot for me to think about. I want to let you all know that a SurveyMonkey and recording will be sent to all registrants with thanks to our corporate partners, the Museum of the American Revolution and the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. This event is the second in a 3-part series, World Affairs and the Enduring Revolution, hosted by both organizations. With that, everybody, please take care, stay safe, and don't forget to vote.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.